You might possibly have noticed that there's an election coming up this week. I say that because despite all of the billions of dollars spent on advertising, there are still people in the United States that probably couldn't name the president and vice president. And unfortunately, there are Catholics who can't tell you who the current pope is. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you a pop quiz. But our duties as citizens of two kingdoms is very important. Our citizenship in the kingdom of God and our citizenship in whatever land we live. Now, in today's first reading, Moses assured the people that if they followed the commandments, the 12 tribes, Israel would have a moral, spiritual backbone that would serve them well throughout their history. And the people as a whole would prosper. Now, there would be exceptions. Many times sinners would have a long, prosperous life, and saints would have a short, miserable life. But the principle, follow the commandments of God, and you have a chance for stability and happiness on earth as a people or a collection of people. Now, in our own election on this cycle, the only topic has been that of the economy. Everything else has been pushed aside. And the truth is there have been periods of economic boom and bust in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and there will be such periods throughout the 21st century. And political leaders will always take credit for the booms and deny any responsibility for the bust. That's the way it always is and probably always will be. But it's a sad note that only the economy could be discussed. What does that say about the soul of a nation, the soul of a people? What does that say about us? Now, Moses would say, is this a land of the commandments of God or not? And we might say, well, it's a land of the vague suggestions of God. But we could see in one commandment after another, in our responsibilities towards one another, how they are not really applied. Honor your father and your mother. And do not commit adultery. Those are the two commandments that form the basis of family life. And both of those are pretty much ignored in the area of law in the land. Parental rights undermined more and more. The stability in marriage undermined more and more. So over the last 40 years, well, there's been an easing of divorce laws in all the states, and actually a promotion of divorce under the false commandment that it's better to get a divorce than to remain in an unhappy marriage. Yes, there are some marriages that are so destructive, so negative, they have to end. But by and large, every marriage has periods of unhappiness. For one or both persons, whether it's because of the economics, because of emotional or physical problems, because of a crisis in a family, unhappiness is a part of life. But there has to be a commandment. I'm sticking with a commitment that I made before God, before the state, and before humanity. And that type of society is one that has a chance at happiness. The ease at divorce and the common element of living together, rather than getting married at all, has led not to the liberation of women, but to the impoverishment of women and the impoverishment of children on every possible level. Can't we discuss that in the common wheel of an election cycle? Since the family is at the heart of any civilization. And then there's the question of children. The intelligentsia of the world, the humanists, have come to an odd point where the humanists are anti-human. This is something new. That whenever a baby's born, it's looked upon as an ecological disaster. No matter what the family situation. There are too many people in the world. We have 7 billion people. The earth can only sustain 1 billion. Let's get rid of 6 billion. I said, not them, of course, 6 other billion. Can't we discuss that? The People's Republic of China, they decided there were too many Chinese in the world. If anyone else would have made that proclamation, they would have been immediately, rightly branded as racist. So they've had all these decades of single-child policy, where if you conceived a second child, there would be mandatory abortion. As a result, they've created a country with no brothers and sisters. Hard to conceive. A country with no cousins. A country with no aunts and uncles to spoil their nieces and nephews. Only the state. Now they loosened up a little bit on it, where you could get a special permit to have more than one child, because most of the families were having female babies aborted because they wanted to carry on the male name. And all of a sudden these young men couldn't find any wives. Well, surprise, surprise. Now, this whole notion that spread around the world, though, of anti-human attitude. Too many of us around. Rather than the commandment of God given in Genesis, multiply and fill the earth, the new commandment is depopulate the earth. Depopulate the earth. What a strange humanity we're a part of. Shouldn't that be a part of the debates in the common wheel of our culture? Completely shoved off the scene. The People's Republic, they're a great model for what the future of humanity is about. By the year 2040, things will have changed in China. Right now, there are 8 people working for every 1 person retired. By 2040, there'll be 2 people working for every 1 person retired. What are they going to do with all those old folks? The same policies that gave us mandatory abortion? Looks pretty likely they'll come up with some sort of mandatory euthanasia. Probably just by, say, cutting off all medical help after an arbitrary age. Something like that. What is humanity coming to? And why can't we discuss it in the public forums? In our own nation, of course, we have legalized abortion in all the states since Roe versus Wade in 1973. Can't we discuss that? What has been the real impact on our society, on our women, on our families? What's it done to us as a people? What is it having an effect on us, even as we speak as religious people? Now, in the Catholic spirit, we say it's objectively morally wrong. The subjective mode in which people make this decision to have an abortion is very confused and complicated. As Catholics, we say to all women that have had abortions or men that have participated in it, turn your heart back to God. Go back to the sacrament of reconciliation. Hear those words, I absolve you from your sins. But also go and sin no more. But to have faith in life can only come about through having faith in God. Once we've lost faith in God, anything goes. And the God that we believe in is a God of love. But a God of love who's committed to us no matter what. But are we committed to God no matter what? That's the first commandment Jesus told us to have. Love God with your whole heart, your whole mind, your whole soul. The rest will start taking care of itself. Then you'll know what love of neighbor is about. But there are other issues as well in our society and in our culture. Why is it that marriage, before there was a Christianity, before there was a Judaism, always was between a man and a woman? It was because humanity at its heart, whatever its religious and philosophical background, had a belief in the future and a belief in humanity. I always bring up that the Roman Empire, as evil as it was, built on arms, built on games, built on conquest, built on having murder on a daily basis as a sport, they saw the importance of family. And so if a free woman was married to a free man, after she had 3 children, she'd be allowed to have her own bank account and start her own business. Why? Because she had made her primary duty of increasing the population of the empire. And if a slave woman was married to a free man, after she had 4 children, she could have her own bank account, start her own business. Why? Because the Romans, as cruel as they were, saw if the empire was to have a future, they would need kids. But now there are other issues as well. Once children come into the world, how are they to be cared for? The best model, of course, is to have a mother and father. And many times, inadvertently, because of death or divorce, there are single parents, men or women. How are they to raise the children? How are they going to get support from their extended family, parents, aunts, uncles, etc., and neighbors? Big moral question. There's the question of the physical health of our nation. Yes, there are many abortions every year, and it's sad. In New York City, in recent years, there have been more abortions than live births, especially in the African American community in that great city, where for every 4 live births, there are 6 abortions. What a horrible time. But once children are born, what happens? How do we care for them as a culture? How do we educate them? How do we form them? How do we reform them? How are our public school systems to be structured, to be financed? These are questions that have moral implications for all of us. And then there's the question of the health of our population. Many people die because they don't have something as simple as high blood pressure medication. Some of them because they've been too busy to go to the doctor, they could afford it, etc. But many because, well, they can't afford to go to the doctor or to buy even the cheapest prescription drugs that would keep them alive decades longer. What's the moral consequences of that? How do we discuss that in our culture? Can't we bring these issues to the public debate and forum rather than eliminating them? Now, the genius of our nation is we have the First Amendment, where the Founding Fathers, who weren't saints, nevertheless were somehow inspired to put that as the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. And starting from the first part of the First Amendment says, we have a right to free assembly, to go to the government, and to petition the government for grievances we have peacefully. But that's sort of been disappearing. Now you could have a demonstration of 200,000 people against Roe versus Wade. This happens every single year in January. No one will report on it. No one will know what happened. It's like if a tree fell in a forest and no one was there, would there make a sound? At the latest conventions, you were allowed to protest at the Democratic or the Republican conventions at a place marked out by the city where no one would go, no one would see, and no one would report on it. How much of the First Amendment's right to free assembly to petition our government is left? They covered for a while the Occupy movement, then it got old news, they forgot about it and what it was trying to do. And then, of course, there's freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And the local papers still are pretty free. I mean, the local editors are covering local stories of interest, etc. But unfortunately, the local papers are in a circulation decline and also experiencing a decline in their ability to have enough reporters. But they take their national and international feeds from one source, Associated Press or the New York Times. How much information do we actually have or get? Very little. And once you start analyzing this, you'll find that there's only about 5 companies, 5 corporations that control 95% of the information we receive. So how do we know what's going on in our culture or not going on? There's some hope on the internet. You could go to newspapers around the world and find out what's going on. It's a little bit of work, but you could do it. There's some information on talk radio. Anytime we up the phone and call into a talk radio program, we could tell people what's going on. But how limited the knowledge that we have is growing. And of course, the very first amendment to the Constitution, the freedom from an established religion and the free exercise of religion being guaranteed, is under great duress and assault. Why can't we talk about that in the public forum more and more? Now, as long as we have the First Amendment, we can address all the other evils of our culture. But once the First Amendment disappears, the hope of addressing any of the evils of our culture, whether it's corruption in corporation, politics, the church, the community in which we live, disappears, and a new dark ages descends on our land, and the future will look grim indeed. So let's take our conscience to vote this election cycle, but think about the next election cycle of how to have a conscience being brought into the public forum so that our nation can have a spiritual and moral backbone that we could all be proud of.